Association's Paleontology Division. So tonight for us, we have Dr. Hallie Street, a Virginia native and College of William and Mary alumna with a background in geology and environmental science. She earned her master's in biological sciences at Marshall University and completed her PhD in biology, ecology, and evolution at University of Alberta under Dr. Michael Caldwell's guidance. Dr. Street spent 3 years at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum's Discovery Centre before joining MacEwan University as an instructor in biology and zoology. Her research focuses on ancient marine animals, with numerous publications on various animals such as ceratopsians, sea turtles, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and this evening she'll share her insights from her work on Mesozoic marine reptiles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Street.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Well, thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to be talking about a few different varieties of marine reptiles that all lived during the Mesozoic. So to let you know a little bit about where I'll be going with all this evening, my presentation tonight will have two main parts. I will start off with a discussion about various adaptations that all of these different marine reptiles do share. Different ways that they've overcome what I might refer to as the aquatic problem. Then once we all have an understanding of a little bit of what it takes to be a marine reptile, then I will spend the second part of the presentation discussing some of the most successful groups of marine reptiles that lived during the Mesozoic. Because while we do tend to focus on ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and while sea turtles did evolve during the Mesozoic, the fact that I have sea turtles with this group of less successful marine reptiles is not to imply that they were not successful. They're in this group here because they're not an ichthyosaur or plesiosaur, but during the beginning of the Mesozoic, the time period known as the Jurassic, immediately after the largest mass extinction event that took place here on Earth, there was a lot of, shall we say, evolutionary experimentation. Many different groups of marine reptiles attempted to go back to an aquatic lifestyle. They were not all very successful. So when I go on to talk about the various groups in the second half of this presentation, they're only the ones that really made it. But there were many different lineages of reptiles that made the attempt. So as I said, this first part of the presentation will be about adaptations. You can think of it as how to build a marine reptile and what was necessary for these reptiles to live in the water. But before I really get into that, I want to step back just one moment and sort of define what it means to be aquatic in general. Because pretty much any vertebrate, any animal with a backbone, the way we have, if you throw it in the water, it can swim, some. You know, if it just sort of stumbles into a slow-moving river that's not very deep, most likely can make its way to shore. If you leave it out in the middle of the ocean, most vertebrates most likely will not be able to survive long enough to find land. So with that in mind, what does it actually mean to be aquatic? Well, I like to think of it as being on a spectrum, particularly from terrestrial to fully aquatic. So as I said, most vertebrates, even terrestrial ones, if you throw them in the water, they'll do okay for a minute or two. So I've got an ostrich here as an example of a fully terrestrial vertebrate. It's an animal that, yes, it needs water in its diet to survive, but it doesn't need a body of water to complete any stage of its life cycle. It doesn't need rivers or lakes or the ocean to hunt, to reproduce, or anything along those lines. The opposite side of the spectrum would be something like a whale. Whales are what we consider to be fully aquatic. They live their entire lives in the water. They do not need land for food. They do not need land for reproduction or any other part of their life cycle, of their life stages. So those would be the extremes. But then you have this shifting gray area in the middle of what can be referred to as semi-aquatic. Crocodiles are a great example of semi-aquatic vertebrates today. They spend some of their time in the water, they might hunt in the water, but they lay their eggs on land. These might not be universal definitions, but these are the ways I will be using these terms throughout my talk tonight. I'll mostly be focusing on that more fully aquatic side of the spectrum. But do keep in mind that on the way to becoming fully aquatic, most of these marine reptiles went through various stages of semi-aquaticness. And this also brings up a differentiation, a distinction between being primarily aquatic and being secondarily aquatic. Fishes, bony fishes, cartilaginous fishes, sharks, goldfish, are all primarily aquatic. Their entire evolutionary history, the ones alive today and all their ancestors, all lived in the water, were all aquatic. So that is what we refer to as being primarily aquatic, always in the water, in their entire evolutionary history. However, all of our living marine mammals and all of the marine reptiles I will be discussing today are all what we call secondarily aquatic, because they belong to evolutionary lineages that one part of that evolution took place on land. So basically, there were aquatic vertebrates, there were fishes, there were terrestrial vertebrates, ones that made the transition from being fishes to being four-limbed vertebrates called tetrapods. And some of those went back to the water again. I like to bring this up because it is important to remember that even though these marine reptiles are living in the water the way fish do, there is differences in their evolutionary history that certainly impact how they went back to the water and how they live in water. So all of the critters that I will be talking about this evening are all secondarily aquatic, having that phase in their evolutionary history where their ancestors walked on land with four limbs. And so that's why they had this aquatic problem to solve. They had fully adapted ancestrally to living on land, being separated from the water, but then they went back to it again. So the first of these aquatic issues that I will talk about is, the first adaptation is a concept of propulsion or locomotion, of moving around. And I'm tethered, so I shouldn't walk around too much, but the question about propulsion, we don't really think about it this way, but it's all about generating thrust. It's pushing against something. And when we're walking around on land on our 2 feet, what we're pushing against is the ground. And what we're using to do that is our feet. However, then you take something like a lizard, you throw that in the water, all of a sudden, what is it pushing against? Well, there's no ground to push against. The water is the only thing to push against. But as far as what do you push against the water with, because the water's all around, all of a sudden there's more options. It's not just the ends of that lizard's toes. There could be other parts of the body that get involved with pushing against the water to generate the thrust, to move them through their new environment. So there are two main categories of locomotion in the water. Locomotion in general, but we're focusing on the water today. One is axial locomotion. So using the vertebrae, the center line of the body, doing side-to-side bends with the body and or with the tail, and it's the entire body that's pushing against the water, that's generating that thrust. And different types of fishes use different amounts of their body as they're swimming. And using fish here as an example, just because, well, we can watch fish swim today. We can't go back in time yet. Somebody build me a time machine to see how ichthyosaurs or mosasaurs were actively swimming. But basically, this is another spectrum of whether pretty much the entire body is moving in side-to-side bends, and the entire body is involved in pushing against the water, or maybe the head's held more still, and then it's just the back half of the body, and it becomes most efficient, most thrust per energy, when it's actually not the entire body doing these undulations, when it's just the tail. Okay, that makes a little bit of sense. If the entire body's moving side to side, muscles all up and down the body have to be contracting, have to be using energy in order to swim. You know, it works. It certainly is useful for maneuvering in tight little spaces. So eels or something like that around a coral reef might use their entire body to swim. But if you're only swinging your tail back and forth, those are fewer muscles being used. A little bit less energy consumption, just a little bit more efficient. And not something you need to remember, but just in case I use this word again later, it's what we call tuniform swimming, named after tuna fish. This is the most efficient mode of swimming. It's what you see in fishes today and what we interpret would have been seen in marine reptiles that swam across the open oceans. So that's using the center of the body. Alternatively, the limbs could be used. So instead of using the main axis of the body, using the appendages. This is particularly seen in plesiosaurs, and I will get back to that later because it is its own whole debate. But using the limbs to row or to fly or to paddle, and using those expanded arms and legs as what's pushing against the water and what is generating the thrust. But if you're long and skinny, that doesn't provide a lot of thrust. That doesn't provide a lot of surface area. So many different fishes today, or marine reptiles in the past, or this living sea snake, have ways to increase the surface area.
We're just going to see if we can, sorry. You're saying they can see the speaker, but not the slides.
They can't see the slides, they can only see.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe I need to do something here, like put on my glasses, and I can actually see what I'm doing. Sorry. Current slide. Okay, so my problem. Okay, so we're gonna say from current slide, and okay. Does that help? My mistake.
All right.
Oh,
So you can minimize your little icon.
if you can hear me, it's working.
All right. Is this bottom part showing up, or, because I know I'm going to have some images down there.
We can hide that too. Yeah.
Height of the floating eating controls. All right. When using either the axial, so that center line of the body, or the appendages, the limbs, for generating thrust, for propelling yourself through the water, increased surface area is your friend. If we think about it with our own selves, if you move your hand even just through the air with your fingers spread apart, you feel very little resistance. As soon as you join your fingers together, of course, air is not very dense or viscous, so it's not the best example, but you can feel more resistance when you move your closed hand through the air. Same is true in water. Fins are more efficient than fingers for pushing against water. So many aquatic organisms have expansions somewhere on their body, usually the part that they're using for propulsion. Expansions, greater surface area, more thrust per swing of the tail or paddle of a limb. So we can see in this sea snake here, the end of its tail is flattened. You know, most of the snake's pretty skinny. It's not pressing against water too much, but the end of its tail is broadened. And we see different trends of that throughout different evolutionary histories. This is an example from ichthyosaurs, where the earliest ichthyosaurs, if they had a tail fin, it was just very small. But we have evidence that at the end of their evolutionary history, they had these big crescent-shaped, very tall tails. Again, somewhat similar to tunas today. And it's the same with the limbs. If you look at a sea turtle today, it doesn't have individual fingers that you can see from the outside. Those bones are still there within its limbs, but the skin grows entirely over that, presses more against the water, generates more thrust. This is a limb from a plesiosaur. And okay, so it's got an upper limb bone like we do. Great, seems familiar. Its lower limb bones are quite short. That's strange, but all right, we'll work with it. It's got a wrist, and it's got, 5 fingers. Still, we're familiar. But then it's got a condition that we call hyperphalangy. Phalangy refers to the individual little bones in a finger or a toe. Each one of those is a phalanx. Get a whole bunch of them together, you get phalanges. And when you get a whole bunch of them together, you get hyperphalangy. So that is one way that particularly the reptiles that were relying on their limbs for propulsion increased the surface area. Through development, they just sort of started repeating and repeating and repeating. And so instead of just having 2 or 3 or 4 phalanges in each finger or toe, all of a sudden they have, I think one is up to about 20, but certainly 12 to 15. So all of these different elements in each finger lengthens the limb, more surface area, more thrust, more propulsion, better swimming. But moving around in the water isn't just about propulsion, isn't just about generating thrust, because all of a sudden, the environment that these secondarily aquatic reptiles are living in is 3-dimensional. Well, I mean, we live in a 3-dimensional world. Yes, we do. It's still all around us. But generally, we move in 2 directions. We can move forward and back. We can move side to side. Yes, we can climb things, but in that case, it's more just that where forward is has changed. But as a terrestrial vertebrate, when we jump, we don't stay up. We have to come back down. Gravity and all that nonsense. Of course, gravity still applies in the water, but because of other properties of water, the animal is held up better. So all of a sudden, there's a third dimension to deal with. It's not just forward and back and side to side. It's also intentional up and intentional down within that environment. Okay, great, can move in all three dimensions if you intend to. Water also has currents and eddies and different forces like that. And so it's also possible for the water to move you in ways you might not want to be moved. So all of a sudden, there's also needing to be control against unintentional movement in each of these directions. And it turns out that fins, in addition to being great at generating thrust, are also useful for helping to counteract unintentional movement. So fins that stick up, top to bottom, help prevent against rolling around that central axis. Those same fins, if they're a little bit elongated, can also help to counteract sort of movement side to side, can help provide just a little bit of resistance. Then any sort of fin sticking out sideways helps prevent the unintentional sort of forward to back, up and down movement. So sometimes there's a structure that serves multiple purposes. Yes, fins can help move the fish. It can also help hold them still in unexpected ways. I've been talking a little bit about the properties of water. And technically air that we move in is a fluid, but water is certainly more of a fluid that we sort of consider to be a fluid. And moving through water does have a different force at play, which is known as drag. And I'm not a physicist, so if any of you are, please excuse my incredible oversimplification here. But basically there are two forms of drag. There's what's known as inertial drag. Basically what that has to do with is if you're moving through water, the water that you're trying to go through, it has to go somewhere. So basically the water in front of you has to be displaced. You're not occupying the same volume of space as the water is. You have to push it out of your way. And we don't think of water as being viscous because in comparison to honey or something like that, it's not. But in comparison to air, water's a lot more viscous. Oh, excuse me, I'm talking about density now. I'm getting ahead of myself. Water's a lot more dense than air. So inertial drag, displacing water, has to do with the greater density of water. So the best adaptation for countering inertial drag is streamlining. Reducing extra bits and pieces that might stick out, having a very sort of smooth and continuous shape. So if we think of lizards like iguanas, they've got spines on their back, they've got different patches here and there. That would not be a very streamlined shape. In comparison to something like a porpoise, very streamlined. Water moves around it much more easily. Now we're talking about viscosity, because that is the other main form of drag. So water is more dense than air, water is more viscous than air. So besides just having to displace the water that you want to move through, it's also flowing over your surface. And that creates friction and this kind of viscous drag. And as humans, one way we attempted to counteract that in the Olympics was with really super slick swimsuits. Turns out they were too slick. So those particular, like super smooth suits have been banned in many different international competitions. Because the way to counteract viscous drag is to be as smooth as possible. We do see this in living marine mammals. There are some marine mammals like seals and sea lions, which would be considered semi-aquatic. They still have fur. Their fur is part of their insulation. But if we think of dolphins and whales, which are fully aquatic, they've lost their fur. and the lack of fur does make their skin smoother, reduces the viscous drag. So particularly for countering drag, in this case specifically the inertial drag, this is where we see these really streamlined shapes. And I really like using slides like this because this is an example of a concept we call convergent evolution. So I've got 4 different animals shown here on this slide, their silhouettes. None of them are related to each other, not directly. None of them are related, but if you look at them, they've all got a similar shape. Relatively smooth, sort of teardrop shaped, some fins sticking out, particularly top and bottom, and that helps with stability. Usually some sort of fin sticking out to the side. Can anyone tell me what this friend up here is? That's a shark. How about this one down here? I need to change that slide. Why, yes, it is. How about this one here? Yep, that's a tuna. Then we've got our wild card. Does anybody know? Hearing a few different things. This is, in fact, an ichthyosaur. So it looks a lot like a dolphin, only its tail is turned 90 degrees and does have a little bit of a hind fin still, hind limb still. But we've got a cartilaginous shark, or cartilaginous fish. We've got a bony fish. We've got a mammal, and we've got a reptile. None of these are very closely related. In fact, the 2 that are probably most closely related would be the dolphin and the ichthyosaur. But evolutionarily very distant from one another, and yet they've all got this similar shape. They've all converged on what is apparently one of the most efficient shapes to move through water, particularly moving through water at high speeds, because all of these are examples of vertebrates that live in the open ocean and swim relatively quickly in their environment. Apparently, due to physics and what the vertebrate genome has to work with, this is the best way to be a high-speed swimming vertebrate in the open oceans. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of our secondarily aquatic reptiles are breathing air. If you think of it, the difference between snorkeling and scuba diving. For whatever reason, once gills were lost in vertebrates, that's something it seems that once they're gone, they don't come back. In evolution, there are many things that can be lost and return, and I mean, this whole going back to the oceans. But for whatever reason, gills just, once that's genetically turned off, it's done. So all of these marine reptiles did have to come back to the surface to breathe air, and that's just something to keep in mind as we're talking about some of their other features. And we do see that their nostrils do migrate a little bit. Not quite to the same dramatic extent as the blowhole in a whale, but we've got a mosasaur skull here. The nostril's not right here all the way at the front. It has migrated to be more up the snout, a little farther up. We don't know exactly what their soft tissue nostrils and ways of closing those off would have been, but it would have made it a little bit easier to breathe at the surface without having to pull the whole head out of the water to breathe. Buoyancy is another adaptation that these different reptiles had to learn to deal with. So going to ask for a show of hands. Which do you think is more beneficial to a vertebrate living in the water? So think about this for just a minute. Do you think it's better for this animal to be able to float really easily? Or do you think it's better for this animal to be able to sink really easily? So let's see hands for float. See some hands for float. I mean, have to get to the surface to breathe. I was just talking about that, right? See hands for sink. See some hands for sink as well. I don't know, maybe their food's farther down. Trick question. There's something in the middle called neutral buoyancy. And that is the most efficient. To basically have a density very similar to the water all around. So that you're not really having to fight the water around you to swim up to the surface or to dive deep. I mean, you still have to expend energy to actually move, but you're not fighting to stay in the same place all the time. So there are various ways that all different vertebrates, whether primarily or secondarily aquatic, have achieved neutral buoyancy. We'll talk about some examples of those when we get there. So, I guess before I get into that, does anyone have any questions about some of these adaptations that I've been rambling on about? All right, then I will talk a little bit about the big three: the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and the mosasaurs. These very successful groups of marine reptiles from the Mesozoic, and show you some specific examples of their adaptations. So first I will talk about the ichthyosaurs. The first ichthyosaurs were found in the early 1800s in southern England, the Lyme Coast, by a young woman named Mary Anning and her older brother. In fact, if you've ever heard the tongue twister, "She sells seashells by the seashore," it's thought to have referred to Mary Anning. So the first ones that were at least found and reported and sort of understood to be something different, yes, were found from Jurassic aged rocks along the south coast of England. And ichthyosaurs evolved pretty much right at the beginning of the Mesozoic. They didn't quite make it to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. They didn't last the entirety of the Mesozoic. They seem to have gone extinct around about the middle of the Cretaceous. And ichthyosaurs had some very specific ways of solving both the propulsion and the drag issues. And they are one of those great examples of that very streamlined body shape. At least they were at the end of their evolutionary history. Their earlier forms were smaller, more elongated, didn't have as much of a, add a cursor, there we go, didn't have as much of a tail fin, and their front and hind limbs were about the same size. So those hind limbs and the forelimbs likely were involved more in stabilizing, encountering a roll and things like that. Because of the shape of their vertebrae, we're fairly certain that they were axial swimmers, that they were using that main axis of the body to generate thrust and to swim. There were many, many different lineages of these reptiles all around the world. And in fact, the largest known ichthyosaurs are from right here in Canada. It's a genus called Shonisaurus. If you've been to the Tyrrell, they've got the giant silhouette of the whole thing out on the floor. That critter was absolutely massive. Probably not the most efficient swimmer. It didn't have this very tuna-shaped body. But throughout their evolutionary history, the hind limbs became smaller and smaller. The fin became taller and taller. And we do have evidence of these fins, even though they didn't have bones in them. There are a few different rock layers around the world, particularly some absolutely extraordinary ones in Germany, that preserve the soft tissue, the body outline of these ichthyosaurs, which is how we do have evidence for a dorsal fin, have evidence for that very crescent-shaped tail fin. And we do have the fossil evidence, the hard tissue evidence of that little teeny little hind limb that was reduced in size. So they became more efficient swimmers, we think. They became more streamlined. And they did have these great fins for countering unintentional movement in the water. Didn't have as much to say about ichthyosaurs. They're the one group in this trifecta that I have not personally researched. Plesiosaurs, the first plesiosaurs reported to a scientific community were also found by Mary Anning. A few years later, same rock formations along the south coast of England, also now found across, fossils found across the world. This group had the longest duration during the Mesozoic. They evolved about the same time as the ichthyosaurs, persisted all the way up to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Plesiosaurs are different from the ichthyosaurs and the mosasaurs in that these were some of these appendicular swimmers. They were using their limbs to generate their propulsion. So all four limbs remained large throughout their evolutionary history. So within the group of plesiosaurs, there are two main, what we call morphotypes, or shape forms. There are the plesiosauromorphs, so the plesiosaur-shaped ones typically have a fairly small head at the end of a relatively long neck. A long neck can be anything from about 25 vertebrae in the neck. Humans have 7 for context. Even giraffes only have 7. They just have much longer vertebrae. Plesiosaurs made their necks longer by adding additional vertebrae. So from about 25 up to 77. Alberta nectes. So one of the elasmosaur types from here in Alberta. Record holder, most vertebrae of any, or most neck vertebrae of any vertebrate, right here. So that's the sort of more commonly associated shape of plesiosaurs. Loch Ness Monster, usually described looking as one of these. Back in the 1800s, when people were first starting to find these, but of course most people hadn't seen them, they were very colorfully described as a snake threaded through the shell of a turtle. Granted, most of them don't have a shell, anything like that, but shape-wise, yes. But a snake through a turtle, yeah, I can see it. The other main shape form is the pliosauromorph, so the pliosaur-shaped ones. So a large head at the end of a relatively shorter neck. Granted, some of these could also have about 25 or 30 vertebrae in their neck, but still then with a big, larger head at the end of that neck. But most of them had fewer than 20 vertebrae in their neck. We do have examples of particularly the polycotylid types from here in Alberta. The big pliosaurs, some of those were also known from England and the United Kingdom. But they have been found all around the world. One of the biggest pliosaurs, pretty sure, is Kronosaurus from Australia. Propulsion in plesiosaurs. So, pretty sure they use their limbs. They do have 4 limbs. Throughout their evolutionary history, the limbs do not get reduced. But the question of how they actively move those limbs around, was the right side and the left side moving together? Was the front and the back moving together? That has been a debate since plesiosaurs have been found. Were they rowing? Were they paddling? How were they moving them? It's been so much of a debate that there have been multiple different ways that people have attempted to answer this question. People have made digital models and subjected them to virtual fluid dynamics tests. Okay, fairly reasonable in the realm of science, got it, okay. People have built plesiosaur robots, granted without the neck, but built robots, put them in water, been able to control the way the paddles move independently, put dye in the water to see what sort of vortices and currents and eddies and turbulence and all of that gets formed by moving the limbs in different ways. Also pretty cool. And people have, I kid you not, strapped plesiosaur-shaped paddles onto grad students and thrown grad students in the pool and said, do your best to swim like a plesiosaur. Published paper, it's out there. Okay, those are very, I mean, if you're a good swimmer, sure, why not? But those are some very agreeable grad students. I don't think I would have done that if my professor had asked, but then I am not the strongest swimmer, so I probably wouldn't have been the best example. But these are all different ways that people have tried to answer the question of how did plesiosaurs swim? What was their method of propulsion? So there are kind of three general hypotheses. Either they were paddling, or they were rowing, or there was some sort of underwater flight going on. Based on the shape of their limbs and how they connect back to the shoulder and the pelvis, pretty sure they weren't paddling. It just seems that their limbs weren't going under them, which would be necessary for a paddle motion. Okay, rowing, sort of more side to side. The skeletal system works for that, but it's not very efficient, has a lot of sort of downtime, and it just doesn't seem like it would work well for long distance swimming. Okay, underwater flight. That creates a lot of thrust, it creates lift, it does all the right kinds of fluid dynamics things, but again, that gets into some problems with the shape of particularly how the forelimb connects to the body. Basically, for true flight, the way birds do, the arm has to be able to go way up above the back. And we don't think, based on the structure of their limbs and their shoulders, that they could have done that. So the current best hypothesis is that there was a kind of hybrid between rowing and underwater flight. That maybe they did a big downstroke like flight, but instead of doing the upstroke, they just sort of recovered like a rowing stroke. And so it was sort of this weird D shape that, of course, our limbs don't do right, but a combination between rowing and flying seems to be the current best hypothesis. And then that gets into, were there forelimbs and hind limbs doing this at the same time? Some people say no, some people say the hind limbs were just for steering. Personally, I say, well, if that's the case, like ichthyosaurs, they would have been reduced. So in my opinion, yes, they were using both their hind limbs and their forelimbs to generate propulsion. Whether they're going at the same time or offset, beats me, I don't know. But I think they were probably using all four of their limbs actively. Plesiosaurs also get to some interesting ways of addressing buoyancy and attempting to achieve neutral buoyancy, particularly the elasmosaurs, so those ones with the really, really, really long necks. For years, it has been known that elasmosaur fossils are quite often found in the abdominal region full of rocks. And these aren't rocks that just washed in during fossilization. First of all, they are actively between the ribs on both sides. They're rocks that don't match the rest of the rocks in the environment where these fossils are found. And these are rocks that are smooth all around, very smooth, but with microscopic pitting on their surfaces. We call these gastroliths, or stomach stones. Stones that these elasmosaurs swallowed intentionally, which started a whole other debate about why were plesiosaurs swallowing these stones. One hypothesis was it was help them grind up their food. So crocodiles and birds have a part of their stomach that's really muscular. It's called, not the crop, it's called the gizzard. And sometimes they will swallow little rocks to help crush up their food with a really muscular stomach. Okay, we know some reptiles do that, makes some sense. Except when we look at, whenever we find preserved stomach contents of elasmosaurs, it's little fish and it's squids. So things that are pretty soft and shouldn't require extra mechanical forces to break them down in the stomach. So that never quite made sense to me. It was also suggested that they were swallowing the stones to help change their buoyancy, that they would swallow stones when they wanted to sink, spit them back out if they needed to come back to the surface more. That never quite made sense to me either, because first of all, where are the rocks? The rocks are at the bottom. So if you can't get to the bottom without the rocks, how do you get the... I mean, yes, okay, they probably could exert enough effort to swim down to get them sometimes, but still just doesn't quite make sense. And then particularly because these are the elasmosaurs with that really, really long neck, you're telling me that they're going to put in all that effort to swallow stones down all that neck and then regurgitate them back up all that neck just to change their buoyancy a little bit? That never quite made complete sense to me either. But more recently, I've heard a hypothesis related to buoyancy that does fit a little bit better. So it's possible that they were swallowing these stones for changing their center of gravity a little bit to change their buoyancy, but not for going up and down in the water column. Again, these are animals with a lot of their mass towards their front. Big, long necks, little head at the end, but still a lot of neck. And so it's possible that swallowing these stones just moved their center of gravity a little farther back in their body. So it's not that it was changing their gravitational position like in the water column. It was just meaning that, so if this is head and neck and the stomach's back here, no, that's not proportional, but if we're using my elbows, the stomach, basically it would just help weight the stomach just a little bit more, just do a little bit of lever action, bring the head up a little bit. So their heads weren't always sort of sinking as they swam. So just a little bit of counterbalance. Maybe in 10 years, someone will come up with another hypothesis, but currently, this is what I think makes the most sense for the explanation of why so many of these elasmosaur fossils are found with all of these stones in their stomachs. Now, that's not the only way that plesiosaurs have addressed buoyancy. The first fossil I worked on, the specimen or the species that was the subject of my master's thesis, was a little plesiosaur from Wyoming known as Taitnectes laramiensis that you never would have heard of, but it's a kind of cool little critter. So a small plesiosaur from Wyoming, and it had some strange bones and what turned out to be a unique overall shape of its body. So strange bones. Plesiosaurs, like most other vertebrates, have ribs coming off of their spines, normal dorsal ribs, but they had a second set of ribs across their belly. And for the most part, those extra belly ribs were relatively thin and narrow, and usually smaller than the ribs on the back. Now, as I said, Taitnectes was this little plesiosaur, probably not more than 2 meters long. But this is one of those belly ribs from Taitnectes, and this is same type of belly rib from another plesiosaur that lived in the same seaway that would have been at least twice its size. You can see that in Taitnectes, the one on the top, how much bigger that belly rib is. And then down here at the bottom, we've got cross sections. So taking a slice through each of these. So this is the larger one, the one these two match here. Relatively normal rib on the inside. You know, it's got some spaces in the middle, some spaces in the middle, a little bit denser around the outside, but that's about the sort of structure we would expect to see inside one of these plesiosaur's ribs. Then if we look at Taitnectes, yes, it's got a little bit more empty space on the inside, but the outer layers of the bone are relatively much thicker. There are processes by which bones can, basically the outer layer, the strong part of the bone, can grow and develop longer and become more massive. We see this in manatees today. Their ribs do something similar. It's thought to be an adaptation to increase density, which impacts buoyancy. Okay, so this little plesiosaur had these unusually dense ribs across its belly. That's strange to begin with. And then one day I realized that the way the back ribs connected to the vertebrae, the ribs would not have gone straight down the body wall. They would have been angled backwards. They would have tilted backwards, so same length, but instead of going just straight down the body wall, all of a sudden, when they rotate backwards, that reduces the overall depth of the body. So most plesiosaurs, looking at their vertebrae, their back ribs, and their belly ribs, pretty much a swimming sausage. Very round, fairly deep, top to bottom. Another type, maybe a little bit more flattened, but still quite round. And then we get Taitnectes down here at the bottom, or as I dubbed it as a grad student, M&Mosaurus. Cut an M&M in half, it's got that same sort of just really flattened silhouette. And so my interpretation was that these were adaptations. This wasn't just something strange, but the dense ribs and the reduced height of the body together would have helped this plesiosaur. Okay, so I've already mentioned this is a little one. I mean, still, fully aquatic plesiosaur, able to swim out in the ocean, but there were 3 other marine reptiles that we know shared its seaway, at least 3 others. All of them bigger than our friend Taitnectes here. And I'm not saying necessarily that those larger reptiles would have tried to eat Taitnectes. Most of their jaws wouldn't have been good for that. But in sort of the open ocean, Taitnectes might have been outcompeted, might not have been able to access the resources because the bigger marine reptiles would have been taking them all. But being smaller, that might have allowed Taitnectes to go into shallower water in this ocean. Not saying it was playing among the waves, but getting somewhere shallower. But even if it wasn't all the way in the waves, the shallower water gets closer to the shoreline, it does get more turbulent. There are more currents. And if you're a swimming sausage, even with your flippers out to the side, something round, if you imagine a beach ball in the waves, it gets tumbled around a lot. Something a little bit more compressed might help prevent unintentional directional movement. More density along its belly changes again that center of gravity. My hypothesis was that Taitnectes was living in relatively shallow water, maybe hunting for squid around the sort of reefs and shoals closer to the water, and that reduced body line, those dense ribs, would have kept it more stable in the water column, not as tumbled around as a more round plesiosaur would have been. Finally, we have the mosasaurs. The first mosasaurs found reported to science were found actually even earlier than the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs. They were found in the latest 1700s, described in the early 1800s, whole mess with their names. Won't bore you with my dissertation on that, but the sort of interesting thing about mosasaurs is that they only live for 30 million years. Yes, I did just say only live for 30 million years, but they evolved in the middle of the Cretaceous and diversified very, very rapidly. As far as evolutionary time goes, they became top predators in the oceans incredibly quickly. So first one's about 30 million years ago, certainly by 25 million years ago, worldwide distribution, and would have been some of the main predators. Mosasaurs are also generally considered to be axial locomotors, so using that main axis of the body, using their tail. We don't have such good soft tissue preservation for mosasaurs as we do for ichthyosaurs, so we don't know if they had a nice big crescent-shaped tail, but we do have some specimens that show a tail bend. So you've got the sort of first part of the tail here, all of a sudden something changes right around this area, and the last part of the tail is bent downward. So we do interpret, we don't have the outline evidence, but we do interpret that they would have had at least some degree of a forked tail, whether the top part was as long or if it was just sort of a little triangular fin up at the top. We do have this sort of evidence that they were using their tails for locomotion. And that's always been the thought, okay, mosasaurs just use their tails, period, the end. More and more, we're starting to think that maybe at least some species had some contribution to their locomotion from their fins. Maybe it was just stability. Maybe it was they used their fins at one speed, their tails at another speed. But for example, this is the forelimb, well, the wrist and fingers of a mosasaur called Plotosaurus from California. And this is another example of that hyperphalange, having all of these different individual elements in the fingers. And these aren't even complete, because this little one here at the end is still sort of shaped like an hourglass. That's not the last one. There'd be at least one or two more in that finger. So these very elongated flippers. And also, this lump of bone here is the humerus of a different kind of mosasaur. Humerus is a long bone, it should be elongated. What were they doing? I don't know, but this is the humerus. And what's interesting about some of these humeri, in some species of mosasaurs, their humerus is still a little bit elongated and it's relatively flat. But in some species, the humerus gets really, really short, in some cases stupidly short, and it's even wider than it is long. And they get these really complex projections, particularly in the sort of more elbow end of the humerus. And pretty much anytime there's a projection off of a bone, something was attached to it, whether a muscle directly or tendons or ligaments, something was going on. And that projection increases the surface area, again, increases the area over which those muscles or those tendons could attach. So evolutionarily, it doesn't make sense to put all of this effort into maintaining these very complex projections unless something important was going on sort of downstream of the elbow. So was it just for stabilizing, for keeping the elbow sort of locked in place so that it wouldn't bend? Or was it doing some sort of control over the distal end, over, the finger end of the flipper? I don't think anybody really knows yet. It's always just been so assumed mosasaurs use their tails for swimming. That is something that's not really been looked into too much. But if you're interested in a mosasaur with unusually large flippers, stay tuned. A colleague of mine, or I'm part of a team that has recently just described a new mosasaur from Japan. That publication is in the what we call proof stages, so it will be out quite soon, but huge flippers relative to the rest of its body. Again, takes energy to grow big appendages, to grow big limbs. Seems unlikely that this mosasaur would have put all that energy into great big limbs if it wasn't getting something out of those great big limbs. So whether it was super stability, just, cruising really still, or whether they were using those fins for more than we used to assume, an area of continued research. This is the silhouette of Plotosaurus, this one with the really hyperphalange flippers. And I like to call Plotosaurus the mosasaur that really wanted to be an ichthyosaur. I mean, minus direct evidence of a dorsal fin. It had a more elongated snout, more narrow snout than many mosasaurs did. Did have those big elongated flippers, and it has one of the most extreme tail fins as far as we can tell. So I said that mosasaurs only lived for 30 million years. They were killed off in the end Cretaceous mass extinction, but it does seem that they were still very rapidly diversifying. We're getting to more niches. This Plotosaurus was one of the last mosasaurs to live. It was right up towards that end Cretaceous mass extinction. So had that extinction event not occurred, who knows how much more streamlined mosasaurs might have gotten if their evolutionary trend had been allowed to continue. However, despite the fact that, as a paleontologist, always kind of wish, I wish they were still alive so I can see how it actually worked. I am grateful for the end Cretaceous mass extinction in this case, because if mosasaurs were still alive today, I would never go in the ocean. When I was doing my research trip studying mosasaurs, going to different museum collections to see these, seeing of the original mosasaur fossil, this particular bone from the back of the skull is about 15 centimeters tall, okay, and that one was interpreted to be about, depending who you talk to, 9 to 15 meters. It's quite a range, probably 10 or 12, it's accurate, but a 12-meter long, very toothy reptile that liked decently shallow water. Okay, that's a little frightening enough. Then next research trip I went to found same kind of bone, closely related species. It was 22 centimeters tall. One of my lab mates happened to look up from taking her own photos as I was holding this massive bone, just with this look of, no, thank you. Would not want to share the oceans with them. So as I wrap up, just a quick moment of why do Mesozoic marine reptiles matter? Well, when these first fossils that were reported to science were found in the latest 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, there was no such field as paleontology. There was no such field as evolutionary biology. It was specimens like these, particularly the plesiosaurs, because they are so different from anything living today, that made naturalists at the time, because they weren't biologists, they weren't paleontologists, so the naturalists of the time confront the concept of extinction. It had been thought that, animals were created, animals existed, and same ones throughout time. But some of these were among the fossils that made people realize these just aren't around today. So marine reptiles have shaped our understanding of the world around us and have contributed significantly to the fields of paleontology and evolutionary biology. Even though the Mesozoic seas probably didn't look exactly like this, with everything living in exactly the same place at exactly the same time, studying these marine reptiles does give us an understanding of what ancient aquatic ecosystems looked like, and what might have happened when some of the top predators, if they went extinct before some of the other organisms, which is useful for today's ecology in cases of when it's the top predators that are being overfished and hunted to extinction. So yes, the marine reptiles that I've just been talking about are all extinct, but they have shaped what we know currently, and they can continue to shape what we learn in the future. I will leave you with this cartoon, a little bit of an alternate history. If mammals had diversified and gone extinct first, and then the reptiles evolved and achieved some very high intelligence. So if you look here in the middle, we've got a little human skull, and you will at once perceive, continued Professor Ichthyosaurus, that the skull before us belonged to some of the lower order of animals. The teeth are very insignificant, the power of the jaw trifling, and altogether it seems wonderful how the creature could have procured food. I like to leave you on a cartoon like this because as much as we know about fossils, and we certainly are learning more all the time, there's always more to learn. Perspectives can always change. So with that, I will take any questions.
Are there multiple specimens, or was this just a single specimen that was cancerous?
That's an excellent question. So the question was those enlarged belly ribs. Was this one individual that might have been ill, or are there multiple specimens? There aren't a ton of specimens. It's not very well known, but there are multiple, and at least 2 or 3 with those enlarged belly ribs. So it's not just one individual with some either infection or cancer or something like that. In its belly ribs, it does seem to have been an adaptation within that species.
And would the Ichthyosaurus died out mid-Cretaceous, and the Mosasaurus started mid-Cretaceous? Do they think that that's a direct competition thing?
So the question was, with the Ichthyosaurs seeming to have gone extinct at the middle of the Cretaceous and the Mosasaurs originating at the middle of the Cretaceous, was the origination of the Mosasaurs, the cause of the extinction of the Ichthyosaurs? That certainly has been hypothesized. I think probably not. The Ichthyosaurs, first of all, they had been sort of dwindling a little bit even before the last of them went extinct. And the ones that were around at the very end of their evolutionary history were the very fast, very efficient, tuna-shaped open ocean swimmers. The first mosasaurs that evolved would have been little, near-shore, very lizardy looking critters. So if the two groups did overlap in time, they probably did not overlap in space. So in my opinion, probably not. So another question in the back, yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did these marine reptiles shed their teeth, or did they retain them?
So the question is about the teeth, and whether, like sharks and some other reptiles, there's continuous shedding of teeth, or whether they were retained. And actually this image here, even though it's a little faint, can help answer that question. So they did have continuously replaced teeth. So it's not exactly like a shark where there's a tooth position and there's always just more teeth coming. But they did shed their teeth, and one other tooth would grow at a time, sort of directly behind the tooth that is shed, and move into position. And interestingly, it was actually the recognition of the way the teeth are attached to the jaw and the way the teeth were replaced that helped, again, these 1800s naturalists recognize that mosasaurs were lizards. So the first one was found in 1760 something. The more famous one was found in the 1770s, and for about 20 years, the naturalists were saying, oh, it's a fish, oh, it's a crocodile, oh, it's a whale type fish, because again, evolutionary biology, not a thing yet, but crocodile, whale, crocodile, whale. Crocodiles replace their teeth differently than lizards do. And it was someone who recognized, oh, this one's replacing its teeth like a giant Komodo dragon, that it was recognized that mosasaurs were actually giant swimming lizards. Yes?
What kind of reptiles did the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs evolve from?
The question was, what type of reptiles did plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs evolve from? And that is an excellent question. We don't know exactly. Ichthyosaurs in particular, the first ichthyosaurs that we find in the fossil record look like ichthyosaurs. You know, maybe slightly strange ichthyosaurs, but they are aquatic ichthyosaurs. It's possible that they are related to a group, so the Hoopasuchians. We've got a couple different hypotheses of where they might be related to. Are they directly related to each other, or is it just the fact that they each have all these adaptations for living in marine life that makes them seem like they're related to each other because those adaptations have basically overwritten any of the features that would indicate their ancestry or their relation to other groups of reptiles? Short answer, we don't absolutely know. But by my most recent understanding, they are more closely related to today's snakes and lizards than to crocodiles. There are hypotheses that they're actually more closely related to crocodiles. It's something that we might never know for certain, just because of all of their aquatic adaptations that make it difficult to see what was there before. Or we'll find the perfect fossil someday.
Thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation, very informative. And
Oh, thank you.
book that you picked.
Thanks.
Yes, and thank you so much. And everyone, if you give me a hand and give it a round of applause.
So the next meeting is December 8th. As I mentioned, there won't be a speaker, but this is your chance to show off your fossils. And I'll take care of that, okay? But we do need you to just to bring us a small snack, which you can share. Let me know what you think you're bringing, so we can kind of coordinate a little bit. Yeah, and then otherwise, help yourself to coffee and cookies. Did you have anything?
Marine reptile fossils here, mosasaur bones and possible plesiosaur rib. So you come along.
Good. Did you have anything?
I also have some rocks and fossils from the crown of the pocket. Dan over there has some mosasaur fossils and things as well. So yeah, do stick around, chit chat, socialize, have a look at rocks and fossils and stuff, have some coffee. So we don't have to jump on and go for a bit. And we'll see you next month.
Yeah, December 8th. Okay, very good. So, okay, so we've done our presentation, and I must apologize. I forgot to share the screen when I should have shared the screen, so my apologies for not doing that correctly. Next month, December 8th, we will not be doing a Zoom meeting because it's just, as I mentioned, a social gathering. So hopefully we'll see you in room B108 next on the Friday, December 8th. Thank you. And I'm going to close the meeting now. End the meeting first.